to this Dharma and Justice dialogue series from the Thich Nhat Hanh Program for Engaged Buddhism. My name is Peace Twesagy, and I am the director of the Thich Nhat Hanh Program for Engaged Buddhism, as well as the Buddhism and Interreligious Engagement program, where students are pursuing graduate degrees here, all within Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. Today's conversation will be with Cristina Moon and Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad, and they'll be speaking about solidarity and accountability in Black and Asian Buddhist Sanghas. And so I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad is a visiting professor of Buddhism and Black Studies at Union Theological Seminary and author of Black Buddhists and the Black Radical Tradition, the practice of stillness and the movement for liberation. And Rima also wrote Racial Purity and Dangerous Bodies, Moral Pollution, Black Lives, and the Struggle for Justice. And I'll tell you a little bit about Cristina Moon, just a little. After a career in human rights and social change organizing and graduating from Stanford University Graduate School of Business, Cristina embarked on 3 years of monastic training at Chozenji in Honolulu. While still in residence as a priest, she continues to train in Zazen, Kendo, Chado, and ceramics, and now works with individuals and organizations to develop the sensitivity and spiritual strength needed to lead in today's challenging world. And so today's conversation will discuss this. As Buddhism gains numbers of practitioners throughout the United States, there is increasing attention paid to cultural adaptation and appropriation within convert Sanghas. How can Buddhist practitioners, including Black Buddhists who have similarly experienced cultural appropriation, respond ethically? Recognizing the distinctive ways in which Asians and Asian Americans have been racialized, as well as the distinctive ways in which Black people have been racialized, how can we address nuances and dynamics in Black and Asian Buddhist Sanghas? Not least as violence continues to be disproportionately inflicted upon Black and Asian community members, how can Black and Asian communities create further avenues for solidarity? And so before I hand over the mic, I would also like to say a quick thank you to the communications team who has helped bring this event to reality, and also the ASL interpreters here tonight. Yeah, so one quick note is for those of you in Zoom, the Q&A box is open. So feel free to put questions that come up as the conversation is happening into the Q&A box if you would like a response from the speakers. Questions easily get lost in the chat. And so, yeah, if you want your questions to be seen by the panelists, please put it in the Q&A box. And for those of you on Facebook or YouTube, we'll do our best to bring your questions in for the panelists to respond to as well. There'll be time reserved at the end of the time we have together for responding to your questions. And so that is all for me, and enjoy this conversation. Welcome, Cristina Moon and Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad.
Thank you, Peace, for that warm introduction. And welcome, Cristina, and thank you, interpreters, for all of your hard work. I am so grateful, and Cristina, so honored to have this conversation with you. And I'll just say, by way of my own personal introduction, that when I met you about 10 months ago at a conference on American Buddhism, I was just so blown away by your clarity and your presence. And it really feels like just an enormous privilege to have a really hard conversation, and one that has been sitting with me for quite some time, especially as I wrote Black Buddhists and the Black Radical Tradition and was really challenged in the writing of that. And so I thought first, maybe we could just take a few moments to arrive and maybe just 2 moments of silence. And then I would love to begin by asking you what leads you to want to participate in this conversation. But if we can sit back for a moment, that would be really wonderful. So, Cristina, I am just struck by all of your experiences and really eager to know what led you to say yes to this invitation.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Rima, and thanks to the Thich Nhat Hanh Foundation and Union Theological Seminary. I think this is a conversation I've wanted to have for a while, and then in general, at this juncture right now, I'm accepting any opportunity to spotlight Asian American Buddhists, and I think that is, given who I am and where I come from, sort of my starting point. 70%, maybe as many as 70% of Buddhists in America are Asian, mostly practicing in Buddhist communities that are predominantly Asian, but that's not the prevailing narrative that we have. We think of mainstream Buddhism as white convert Buddhism, but in reality, that's a minority. That's a really small percentage. And it just feels, from my own experience of having been in a couple different Buddhist worlds, I spent about 12 years in different Theravada communities, practicing, doing a lot of meditation and retreats. And when I came to Chozenji in 2018, it was just so eye-opening for me for a number of reasons that I think we'll get to talk about. Part of it is the demographics and just the cultural foundation of Hawaii. And then part of it was just this place and the method of training that's here. But I was sort of able to see what's possible when Asians aren't erased from the history of Buddhism and from the actual day-to-day experience of the Dharma, how the role of cultures in particular that have evolved over literally thousands of years, imbued with Buddhism, and in many cases, for the purpose of giving people the opportunity to experience the Dharma and its teachings, how powerful that can be. So I think that's really, part of the reason that I said yes. And the other is wanting very badly for a long time to find this space of meeting between Black and Asian American Buddhists, and wanting to see not so much just like, I'm very self-conscious about putting it out this way because I don't want to sound condescending. But my first question, especially just with the constructs of color and race in our country, knowing sort of where people fall, is I want to be of service and I want to have this conversation, and I want to know how my tradition, how other Buddhist traditions and Asian American communities can be these places of solidarity and support, and what it is that we have to do, the hard work we have to do for ourselves to be able to do that. So yeah, that's part of why I was really excited when you reached out.
I was so grateful that you said yes, in large part because, and I was thinking through this and communicating this earlier, I have been really challenged, particularly with this question of cultural appropriation, and have read a number of Asian American Buddhist writings, and mostly blogs. Frankly, that seems to be where I can find this particular conversation. But there is this acknowledgement and critique of the ways in which Buddhism is constructed in this country, is known, is absorbed, is interpreted. And I don't want, as Black Buddhists become more visible, for us to replicate patterns of harm. And I'll just share an experience that was revelatory. And I am grateful for this challenge, which is by Duncan Ryukun Williams, who, as many of our audience members might know, is the author of a book called American Sutra, which details the internment of Japanese Americans, including many, many Japanese American Buddhists during World War II. And Duncan was one of the readers for my book. I sent it out for review and I was told, add a chapter on Buddhism. And I wrote this chapter, and then it was sent out for review again, the entire manuscript. And he was one of my readers. And he said, you can't stay within a Black-white binary, and essentially said I had erased the voices of Asian and Asian American Buddhists. I had two in the plethora of voices I included. And I heard that challenge, and I could tell that I needed to be challenged and pushed as I was privileging the voices of Black Buddhists. I did not want to participate in that erasure. And I've also been, I think, beautifully taught by some Black Buddhist teachers about how to acknowledge the Asian roots of Buddhism in a way that really does bring into light, really does illuminate the fact that these teachings, these doctrines and practices were carried forward, that I personally have access to them because of Asian monastics and scholars over centuries. But as you pointed to, that has been largely, almost completely erased in the ways in which so many of us are accessing Buddhism. And it feels ethically important, it feels culturally important, it feels important for the whole of how Buddhism is articulated and practiced in this country, for us to be really sensitive and to attune to the fact of erasure, but also not to replicate those patterns of harm. So I appreciate you bringing into light the vast majority, right? 70% of practicing Buddhists in this country are of Asian descent, and how to bring that more fully into perspective.
I think too, what you were just saying about honoring the Asian roots of Buddhism also made me reflect a little bit on what I've learned living in Hawaii, where because of the temporal proximity, how recently the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom happened at the hands of white business owners in the US government, and then very more recently statehood for Hawaii. There's this sense of still a real active colonization here. And because it is the Hawaiian homeland and Native Hawaiians still live here, there's this sense of, honoring the original occupants of this place. It's not in the past tense. It's like Hawaiians and other Polynesians are here right now, experience severe disenfranchisement, and the legacies of colonialism and an active colonization still happening with our military presence here. And so I think that has given me maybe the audacity and the courage to be more vocal in pointing out that it's, Asian American Buddhists are here right now, and we're being erased right now, not something that necessarily happened in the past. And it's always really rewarding to me to explore in what ways can actually the Asian American cultures, again, which are imbued with Buddhism and involved alongside Buddhism, how can they just be incorporated today and seen not as they've historically been seen, which is a sort of like cultural baggage that needs to be gotten rid of, but actually as vehicles for the Dharma. That is really what they are. And to give maybe some context on that in terms of where I'm coming from, because I am the first to admit that where I'm coming from is really weird. And Chozenji is this Rinzai Zen temple at the back of a valley on the island of Oahu. And we're also a martial arts dojo. And we were started by these two very iconoclastic, very impressive individuals. One was Japanese American, but born and raised in Honolulu. And then the other one was Japanese, but they were both really, really highly trained martial arts masters, as well as trained in Zen. And so we have this interesting approach that they put into motion out of frustration with the Rinzai Zen establishment in Japan, and out of frustration with what they saw and perceived as Zen in the West. And that was, for them, they wanted to bring this word this Japanese word called shugyo, the deepest possible spiritual training or discipline, to the West. And their idea of how to do that was through the martial arts and the fine arts, in addition to the traditional sort of monastic Zen training. So a lot of seated meditation, chanting, a certain rigorous schedule. But in addition to all of those things, we also train in, like Peace said in my intro, my bio, kendo, the way of the sword, aikido, karate, but also tai chi and boxing, and also in the fine arts like Japanese tea ceremony, ceramics, calligraphy. And all of these things are not just cultural activities for the sake of preserving culture or for their own sake. Like, nobody is under any illusion that I'm going to become like an amazing kendo person or a swordswoman or even a ceramicist. But the function of all of these arts is actually we're using them as they were in many ways originally intended, which is as do, this Japanese word do that means the Tao or the way. And so it's not just swordsmanship, it's the way of the sword, the way to realize your true self through swordsmanship, through the techniques of the sword and the lessons embedded in there. And so, you know, we're this really weird place where culture has a very, very strong role. And in a way that's just struck me from the outset as so almost revolutionary, where it's like, it's not culture because it's just important that we preserve it. It's not culture for its own sake or because it's the right or just thing to do. It's actually because these are modes of training in Zen and Buddhism. And the things that I've learned about Zen, about the world, the universe, about myself, by learning to serve a cup of tea, by sitting at the potter's wheel for hours and hours on end, by getting hit over the head with a bamboo sword, like, those have been as important a part of my Zen training as, you know, working on a koan with my Zen teacher. Like, the sword and the tea, they are koans in and of themselves. They're like these mind-bending riddles that force me to go beyond rational thought. And that's sort of where the real promise of Buddhism lies.
That's so beautiful. And I think there is so much congruence in what you're describing in terms of uplifting culture as a way into the teachings, as a way to live out the teachings, rather than saying certain things are cultural affects of Buddhism, and over here we're going to meditate in silence. But rather there's a kind of merging or a kind of meeting, if you will, a way through. And I'm struck because in my interviews of Black Buddhist teachers, I conducted over 40 interviews and then included writings and Dharma talks and blog entries by another 30 Black Buddhists. And what was so central to these writings and within these interviews was the fact that culture, that in this case, Black culture, is also a conduit for Buddhism. And it's something that I have actually grown to love so deeply. Like, how do we read Black writers and hear the Dharma? Or, you know, just thinking of a sanctioned Dharma teacher in a Tibetan lineage who talked about Harriet Tubman and, you know, has both James Baldwin and Harriet Tubman on their altar, and just the ways in which we can claim culture as central rather than maybe approaching Dharma as a kind of scientific endeavor that, you know, is akin to, say, psychotherapy or, you know, merged with psychotherapy, but rather really seeing culture as an expression. And maybe this is one way in which Asian American Buddhist practice and Black Buddhist practice really understand each other and mirror each other. And I'll also just say, in my interviews and my research, another way this came out so beautifully was in honoring ancestors and how central that is in Black communities, which, you know, borrow from many different West African religious traditions, but also that's so central within a number of Asian traditions as well, as the honoring of the bowing, the prioritizing or privileging of Sangha and community of people. And it does seem as though there's this kind of mirroring that's so beautiful and worthy of recognition, right? A kind of acknowledgement or understanding.
I think that there are so many aspects of everything you just described, the closeness to your ancestors, arts, culture, beauty, strength that are actually just universal. I think they are universal experiences, human experiences of culture. And they've been erased by this construct of whiteness in America, which and Rima and I've talked about this before as like, there's this fallacy that some like modern Buddhism in America is this like modern acultural, like this construct or this existence without a culture, that it's scientific, that, it's been scrubbed of all that stuff. So now we're just focused on the Dharma and the Buddha and meditation. And it's just not true. It is a culture. It is this constructed white culture. And I really feel that when Black folks, when Latinx folks, Indigenous folks, Asian folks, they encounter it, and that little discomfort and then that hunger for culture, really of any form, it's really just a reaction to like, for lack of a more artful terms, like, this feels like BS. Like, this doesn't feel like, I'm not buying this, that it's just this acultural phenomenon or something that's being created that transcends culture. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we're hungry for, is that sense of authenticity that is, I think, universally tied to a sense of connection that is not just right in the here and now, but goes back and forward in the generations. Absolutely. And I think it's kind of a universal hunger that a lot of us have. And that's why so many folks, including white folks, are turning to ritual and this sort of bricolage of different spiritual practices to try to sort of knit back together this sense of wholeness that a lot of the manifestations of Buddhism in America today, I feel like, for people, are missing.
Yes, that makes so much sense. And truthfully, Cristina, and this was, of course, the origins of this new inquiry for me of, how to do this well. I am really sensitive. I'll use the word cautious or maybe even anxious about aspects of cultural appropriation. And I would love to hear your thoughts about how you see this entry into the Dharma. And I'm specifically thinking of people of African descent, but how you, from your perspective as someone who is of Asian descent, and if you want to tell us about your background, I invite that, but, just the fact that you are located in the geography you are, the heritage you claim, that it also claims you, how you see this entry of people of African descent into Buddhism and into Dharma.
Again, reflecting on Chosen-ji, I was really happy to learn this after I'd arrived. Chosen-ji has had Black members and Black priests, honestly, almost since the time it was founded in 1972. And that, to me, I was really happy to see, because I didn't expect it in a place that felt, to me at first glance, like so Japanese. But it turns out it's really reflective, actually, of just Hawaii. It's a very local mix. And I think part of what allowed that to be possible was that in Hawaii, because of the demographics and the fact that Buddhism is actually the second largest religion in the state because of the majority of Asian people here, there is an association of Buddhism with Asian cultures or Asian communities. People think of Buddhist temple and they don't think of the mindfulness meditation studio or center. They think of the Hongwanji, or they think of the Palola Chinese temple, or something like that. And I think when people at the outset, no matter who you are, so even me, sort of as a Korean American person coming into, say, Japanese settings, when I acknowledge really sort of the true roots of where I'm stepping into and the belonging and sense of responsibility that people have, then it becomes really easy to, it doesn't make it completely easy, but it makes it easier in those moments when I feel that twinge of otherness or outsiderness, or just the discomfort of like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now or what I'm supposed to say. And I feel like I'm doing something wrong and it makes me maybe feel unwelcome. It's like, it helps me just check the facts and gain some perspective on where I am and the historical and current circumstances that people are dealing with. So if I were to think of, for example, like the Hongwanji, the Jodoshin Buddhist temples here in Hawaii and on the continent for that matter, those are places that the Buddhist churches of America literally became the Buddhist churches of America instead of the Hongwanji during World War II and in the concentration camps. That's where they changed their name. And so they could be more palatable and less threatening to a Western, community and to American imperialism. And so even that context alone, and then the more current context of the religious disaffiliation of Asian American Buddhists, younger Asian American Buddhists leaving temples and no longer identifying as Buddhist for multiple reasons, but including their sense of otherness and racism that they experience as other because they're Buddhist. When I think of that, it makes it easier to go into a space and understand why people might have some of their own tightness around my being there. And then it makes it easier for me to put in to maybe put my discomfort on the shelf just for a little bit and wait for the moment when maybe it can be addressed. But really just the only thing I have control over is myself. So I can ask myself, what can I do in this moment to make myself and everybody around me feel good? And I just feel like if we start from that place of a less colonized, not a colonized view of I'm looking at a Buddhist space through what whiteness tells me it should be. And therefore, what I see is it's foreign, it's exclusive, it's not open. That's a really different place than if I'm going in and sort of seeing really fully what the community has experienced and is experiencing, and then thinking more intentionally about what I want my relationship to them to be.
Yeah, I think that perspective of how do we decolonize and try to understand how colonization has taken many different forms in this country, and also just thinking about this larger backdrop and how there's this kind of constant reference to whiteness and white supremacy, and how we internalize that, and in many ways, and this has been such a huge part of my own practice, understand how we might internalize these narratives and then see through those narratives or turn them on to those who are closest to us or those to whom we are approaching or in close proximity to. I think that capacity to see more clearly, to start to strip away these narratives is so important. And you said something at one point that really struck me, and I'm going to quote this, and I would love for you to tell me if this is not quite accurate, but you mentioned that you thought of Black Buddhists coming into an Asian religion, such as Buddhism, as being drawn because we might have karmic affinity. And I just thought that was such a beautiful statement, that for you, it's not a kind of appropriation, particularly if there is that desire and capacity to see through the layers of colonialism, to see how our minds are colonized. If we have this capacity to decolonize our mind and we're drawn to Buddhism, that for you, it's not an aspect of cultural appropriation to turn to the teachings, the rituals, the practices, as much as for you, Cristina, Reverend Cristina Moon, this aspect of someone having a karmic affinity to Buddhism. And so for you, from your perspective, is from what I heard you saying is that you can really honor that rather than seeing a kind of whitewashing of Buddhism, rather a deep desire that maybe goes back centuries according to our karma. It's quite possible. Of course, we can't know for sure, but from your perspective, you can really honor this aspect or this movement of Black people towards the Dharma. And we are coming in rapid numbers. I mean, just thinking of publications and retreats. And I mean, I'll just say personally, the number of people who are in touch with me, who are drawn to a book on Black Buddhists, it's really quite profound. So I appreciated that because it has been a huge part of my for more than a year, close to a year and a half now, really, since working with Duncan's questions, it's been a huge part of my own ethical practice and journey. And I thought that was just beautiful and very welcoming, frankly, you know, just to honor a kind of karmic resonance, if you will.
Yeah, the flip side of decolonizing one's view is that as Asian American Buddhists who maybe have our own community and experience folks from outside of that community coming to us and wanting to be a part of it or wanting to, you know, learn the Dharma, practice the Dharma, we also have to shed our colonized view, which is this racist stereotypes that we might have about people. And that has been, I have to own, even though I can't speak for the entire Asian American or Asian American Buddhist community, I mean, I have to own that is part of our legacy and part of our community, something that we have to work through and we have to deal with. And the best way for us to deal with that is in community, is in relationship. That's what allows us to have a longer timeline than just this week, this day, this encounter, and really is about encountering each other throughout the whole length of our relationship, potentially our entire lives. If we do this Zen thing right, honestly, at Chozenji, we are training with each other for the rest of our lives. And that's a pretty amazing thing, and also gives me a lot more patience in my individual relationships with people and in my maybe expectations of where they're going to go in their training. But I think I just wanted to say that because it's equally important on both sides, or on all sides. There's this shedding of a colonial perspective, colonized perspective that needs to happen in order for us to just engage each other as people and as beings with complicated histories that may include multiple generations and lifetimes of karma. And also just this appreciation that, heck, if somebody found us, I mean, especially say Chozenji, like out of the back of this valley, most local people, when they come here, they're literally like, I've never driven this far back in the valley before. I didn't know there was anything here. And that's of course, even though we're 10 minutes from downtown and 15 minutes from the international airport, but still people have that reaction. And that's only more true if you're coming from outside of Hawaii. And if you've somehow found this place, and then if you're drawn for us to the particularly vigorous and demanding brand of training that we do, then there's got to be a reason. And for a lot of people, there's nothing in their family history, there's nothing in their individual experience that would make it so. But some people, they walk through the gates and they feel like they've come home.
Yeah, and I will also say that I have seen these really kind of beautiful connections, like celebrating Black History Month through Lion's Roar, which is a predominantly white Buddhist magazine, but has really attempted in the last couple of years to be very intentional about more multiracial coverage, and particularly lifting up Black and Asian voices, and just to see Asian Buddhists celebrating Black history and thinking again about Duncan Regan Williams and how he uplifts Frederick Douglass as someone who is very much a proponent of immigration of Chinese workers who were coming to the United States in the 1800s, and then Black Lives Matter, just seeing a number of Asian American Buddhists joining that protest and being very vocal. And also, as there has been increasing violence against Asians in this country, Asian American peoples in this country, it's also seeing that there is a kind of, I hope anyway, a kind of reciprocity of saying, oh, this is something we have to address very explicitly as people, as, you know, communities, broadly speaking, of dark-skinned people who have also experienced disproportionate violence. So I can see that there are these ways of connecting and forming solidarity, and working through, as you were pointing to, anti-Blackness and how that gets internalized. I think for Black people, really being deeply sensitive to what it means to be an immigrant in this country or have parents who have immigrated, and the numerous challenges that are often invisible, but being really sensitized to the numerous aspects of challenges, the ways in which that leads to, I'm going to use this word very intentionally, and I welcome your perspective on it, but that leads to a level of trauma that is often not acknowledged, that's often not recognized.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of landmines and dangers in engaging in this work, and because of the trauma, and some of it, again, is not just historical, but is playing out today in real time, and then also other transformations that are happening today in real time. One of the things that I think of is that the Asian American community is having a renaissance right now. You look at the Oscars and everything, everywhere, all at once, sweeping the awards, and really the awards season. And I mean, Asian beauty is a thing that is actually being uplifted, and it's becoming a thing. For the first time in my lifetime, like, I didn't have Asian role models, and especially not a diversity of Asian role models who were considered beautiful, for example, for all of my childhood. But I look at the tween TV shows and the movies, like Prom Pact and all of the things, and they're Asian American protagonists. And then actors and actresses and models who are Asian American who are really considered beautiful and heartthrobs. And that is not unlike, I think, the Black is Beautiful movement of the 1970s, and 60s. That is not insignificant for where the Asian American community is today. And in our ability to feel secure in who we are and in our strength and in our safety, the violence notwithstanding. It's the paradox of these two things happening at once, but it's giving us more ground to be able to not just be defensive. And then that's going to allow us to interrogate more of our own biases as we go forward.
Do you see that happening in Sanghas that are predominantly Asian Buddhist Sanghas?
Yeah, definitely. There's an openness and a willingness and more of a sense of safety in actually saying, no, we really do want to be Asian, us together. I was just interviewing two of the founders, or one founder and one early member of the Young Buddhist Editorial, this sort of online magazine coming out of the Jodoshin Buddhist community. And there was something that Devin Matsumoto, one of the founders of YBE, said about pushing against this push in the Buddhist churches of America to really put the future of the BCA in non-Americans of Japanese ancestry, because they just felt that they had to open up and diversify in order to survive, because their numbers are dwindling so much. And his response was not being sure that they had to do that, that there could actually be something equally valuable and eventually welcoming in actually embracing who they were as Americans of Japanese ancestry, or that it could be done in a way that was not exclusive. Like, you don't have to lose your culture in order to be still welcoming to people who grew up in different cultures. And I feel like that attitude would have been harder to come by in previous years. There'd just be the sense of like, no, there isn't value, like white is right, that is the norm for what we should aspire to. And this willingness to sort of throw away our Asianness in the past.
There's a kind of turning towards, and I think your word security is so important in what you're pointing to, because it suggests a depth of vulnerability that is perhaps largely invisible, especially because popular culture doesn't necessarily represent nuance, if it represents at all. And so, I want to also pick up on that and say, I wonder if there's a kind of similarity. I'm really thinking of the shifts institutionally in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. So that's very recent. Like there's this kind of pushing against a dominant culture, just people taking to the streets en masse, in really an unprecedented way. I think while some of these shifts ebbed and flowed, and I think many people were very, very disappointed, ultimately, for a while, in the midst of this pandemic with these mass protests, there was a sense of like people were paying attention to disproportionate violence, and there was a kind of visibility of Black embodiment, and a kind of recognition of Black worth, and the charge that recognition is fleeting, is fleeting, I think is warranted. But in the ways that you're talking about security, I wonder if there's a kind of internalizing. This is a real question. I'm not saying this is an answer or a comprehensive response, but kind of internalizing of like, I'm going to take a stand, and also that other people will also stand. Here's something that stood out to me, a New York Times article that I read approximately a month ago, in which police officers stopped a Black man in the street. This is in Brooklyn, and bystanders surrounded them and interrupted them, and ultimately the police officers left without arresting the man. But the bystanders were, standing up, like really unwilling for a kind of stop and frisk situation to take place, so that there's a kind of emboldening, if you will, so that there's not such a sense of being marginalized or shutting down or silencing ourselves communally, but a kind of speaking out. I do want to, though, think deeply about how we function within what we might call Buddhism in the United States. And this term American Buddhism is really grating for me, but I'll just say Buddhism in the United States, and how we can really actively, as we began talking about with mirroring, how we can really actively support one another. And I'm really curious about this. I feel like this is so central to how Black Buddhists are, I hope, seeking to evolve practices and recognition of lineages. And I would love to hear your thoughts about what might be possible.
Again, I think being out here in Hawaii gives me a skewed perspective. Might make it more difficult for me to answer this question. Also, it's not just that I'm in Hawaii. It's I'm just in this temple and engaged in the world, but I'm here a lot. Let's put it that way. I think that we can just really engage each other openly. And I like your use of the word mirroring. And what I would throw back is cultivating the sensitivity to be able to identify where there's resonance. And so, for example, you write about in your book, and it has been my experience as well in interacting with different Black folks in spiritual space, and particularly people with Buddhist leanings or Black Buddhists, but this desire for a more somatic, physical, and embodied aspect of their spiritual practice and development. And that's something that, for me, resonates really clearly. And that's something that feels like that's what we do at Chosenji through our training in the martial arts and the fine arts and just the physicality of this place. And that's something that we can't force our way of doing it onto anyone. But when people are open to it, and say like the Embodiment Institute, Prentice Hemphill has an interest in learning about some of the roots through Aikido and then Zen of somatics and embodied practice that way. It's like, great. Like, we will roll out the red carpet because we feel that resonance that's there. And again, we can't manufacture it and we can't force it. It feels inauthentic in those moments, but we can really deeply do our thing. And then when there are moments where it feels like there's synchronicity and also just sort of brotherhood and sisterhood to be able, and siblinghood to be able to just seize the opportunity, that feels like sort of the point of what our training is supposed to be. But there's not like a clear-cut answer, like we have to do XYZ. It's, I think, gets back to what is my stock, like always my answer is just, what are you doing to know yourself as a person, so that when that opportunity arises, one, you can recognize it, and then two, you're able to jump up and grab it. And I think at the end of the day, like when we talk about whether it's understanding the nature of reality and perception in Buddhism, or gaining clarity through taming our breath and our concentration, it's like that at the end of the day is kind of like what we are looking for. It's the practical application of all of those skills and of that insight that we get through our Buddhist training. That's how it should manifest. And so we can take action to make the world better.
Yeah, that's beautiful. All of it, the embodiment and the somatic practices, it's so central to so much of what Black Buddhists are really, I think, acknowledging as a way forward with healing intergenerational trauma as one aspect of their practices. And really knowing ourselves by being able to attune to the body. That, I mean, that's that sense of self-knowledge, can we attune to our breath, and can we notice when something happens, how we react, but rather than being reactive, can we pause and really know ourselves rather than acting out of whatever trigger has arisen.
Yeah. And then not only that, but can you shift the tone in the room without having to say a word? Through your breathing, through your posture, through your presence. It's totally possible. People can do it.
Absolutely. I wonder, just thinking of that and wanting to know your practice more deeply, if you can talk about your training so that you have come to this place of being able to be so aware that you can shift the tone without saying a word, if there's language for it, and perhaps there isn't, but I'm reminded of Zenju, Earthland Manual, and the way that she talks about her practice and emptiness, and how it's not different from claiming her identity, but it's also something entirely larger, if you will. That's my language, not hers. And so what you're touching upon suggests, I mean, of course, you are both in Zen traditions and Zen lineages, but what you're touching upon suggests a depth of practice that is so large. You can both turn to your social identity, your cultural practices, and also embody a way of being that is, it's deeply, deeply expansive and not in opposition to any of that.
I would say we're all shifting the tone of wherever we are without doing anything, because I don't want to get all metaphysical, but we're all vibration. And, whether you're following a more quantum physics standpoint or the Buddhist standpoint of the rupa kalapas down to the most minute particles of matter that can be perceived. At the end of the day, whether you're talking about atomic, subatomic particles or rupa kalapa, we're all just vibrations of energy. And it's a hard thing to talk about. It would be much easier if I could just show you, but that's kind of hard to do over Zoom. But really, we've all been in that experience where we've had someone walk into the room, we go see grandma and it just feels better. Or someone walks into the room and it feels icky. And it's like, they haven't even done anything yet. So we're all doing it all the time. It's just a matter of whether we can become conscious of it and disciplined enough and creative enough, empowered enough so that we can actually change it. And I think that, and this might be somewhere where, again, I can like bring it back to the sense of solidarity, shared accountability, and affinity that I think different communities of color, and in this specific case, Asian and Black Buddhists, can have, which is that there's a certain urgency and an importance. Like there's a sense of no time to waste in figuring out how do we do this. There are practical situations that we find ourselves in where we perceive danger or where we feel discounted in some way, where we would like more at our disposal than, I don't know, what sort of like traditional society has taught us, which is that I have to intellectualize my way through this situation, or I can reason with this person, but sometimes there's no reasoning with that person. And there's just the, am I in command of myself? Can I change the tone of the situation? There's got to be something that I can turn to that's like a little less tangible, but that is also there. And there's like, the best way I can describe this is that, you know, in Zen training, we manufacture these situations. So when we sit Zazen, for example, we sit for 45 minutes and you're not allowed to move. And you experience a lot of discomfort. And when you're talking about intensive training periods, we're talking about just straight up pain. And then the process of Zazen also is just, it takes away some of your guard. And so things come to the surface, emotions arise, and you'll be sitting in there in the dojo, and the person next to you just starts crying, like heaving sobs, crying. And you can't move, and you can't go talk to them. You can't put a hand on their shoulder, but you care about this person. You want to take away their suffering. And in those moments, you are forced to figure out, is there anything I can do? My presence, my breath, my posture, my concentration. Can I just create a feeling? Can I make it feel like I can take her suffering away for just a moment? Sometimes you have to go up and do something like ring a bell or light some incense. Can you do that and move in the room so that it feels refreshing to everyone? Because everyone's got their eyes open. We're facing the center of the room. You can all see each other. I've been the person in the dojo crying and knowing everybody can see me. And so in those moments, it's just, you know, you're actually practicing and training with a certain sense of urgency of like, I really want to figure this out. It is important to me right now. And I'm willing to suspend my disbelief and do things that feel unreasonable or impossible even. My legs are on fire. But can I sit here even stronger, like a mountain for this person? Can I forget about my pain and make that secondary to, I want to try to take care of someone else before myself? Like that, that I feel like the utility of that, the importance of that, I think is just so much more easily understood by people who are experiencing hardship and oppression. And that is where the greatest affinity and I think sense of solidarity can come from. Just the sense of we have a shared history, distinct, but yet a shared experience of having our culture, our languages, our religions, our beauty, our strength, our beings outlawed, banned. And I think that just, that memory is still with us and gives us a sense of like, it's worth trying to do this. And so I guess where I'm going to is you quoted, I'm going to forget his name now, Kevin Kwashi.
Yes.
In your book about I think the quote is, the determination to see Blackness only through a social public lens, as if there were no inner life, is racist. And I think I'm trying to go a little bit is, as people, just as people, we have to do everything we can to erase racism, to combat it, to purge it from ourselves and from society, and to respond to the instances that we see now. As Buddhists, there is the inner life for us to look to. That's, I mean, the thing that we do as people is a given, but as Buddhists, we can train, we can find the urgency to do so. And it has to come from somewhere, because it's not easy.
No.
And I have talked about this before, that really whatever kind of Buddhism you're involved in, it's not easy.
Cristina, thank you so much for surfacing and bringing forth the why of practice, why we practice, why Black people who have largely, widely grown up in church communities are turning to Buddhism. And it is that cultivation of inner life and that cultivation of stamina, that capacity to train, to turn towards suffering and to stay with it, not repress, not deny, not reject, not project, but to stay with it and to know our suffering so intimately that we then can, develop a kind of bodhisattva heart, a kind of expansiveness, right? And that ability, I love your language, to train, and I could tell you have such a depth of training, but the language I have generally used is practice, or to stay, that ability to stay, to turn towards, to develop these muscles, if you will, does provide a kind of fortitude, the kind of presence you mentioned, that expansiveness or spaciousness, to then meet the hardship. And my great hope is that even though our communities, broadly speaking, our racial groups have been racialized very differently within a dominant culture, that desire for inwardness, that desire for inner stamina, and for these teachings, which are so life-giving, that really takes precedence, and that we can really meet each other in ways that are mutually supportive and reciprocal, and that honor, that illuminate this deep, deep desire for that inner spaciousness. I love that. And I'm so glad you brought Kevin Kwashi into the conversation. It was such a formative book. It's the title is The Sovereignty of Quiet. And it's such a formative book because it insists that while Black people have had this kind of public persona collectively, this kind of moral authority, think the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, there's so much more, and that has to be honored and recognized as well. We're so much more than our public facing actions, and that we really do want to respect that depth, and also recognize what it gives us in the fullness of our communal lives, within our families and within our broader communities, and within the struggle you've talked about, the urgency. We have to go inward if we are going to be complex people and also have stamina. There's a depth of, I love your term urgency as well. There's a depth of urgency to honoring our inner lives. And when I wrote Black Buddhist, it was actually two vanguard activists saying, yes, the struggle is present, it's urgent, and you matter too.
The work that we do in developing ourselves is honestly the most important activist and internal activism that we can do. we have this sort of informal saying here at Chosenji, how you do anything is how you do everything. And then I think there's another quote. I might butcher it, and I'm also forgetting who it's by, but excuse my French, if you're fucked up and you lead a revolution, you're going to lead a fucked up revolution.
Yes.
So we all have to work on who we are every moment. And that makes me think too of another quote from your book of Charlene Carruthers talking about liberation as this ongoing activity. In that same way, our attempts to refine and perfect ourselves is a lifelong activity. Our training is our life. And in my, in my world, training is life and life is training, in the sense that I'm not spending every moment of the day sitting in zazen and swinging a sword, but I'm looking at every experience that I have as an opportunity to realize myself.
Yes.
And the beauty of that is that it equips us in the short term, again, so that we can be more effective in the movements that we're in. Because when you take that approach of like life is training, then it's a lot harder to get bogged down or beaten down. Because you can have this sense, and I had this sense when I was an activist of just feeling like it was too much and it was too hard sometimes. And this question of like, where am I going to find the energy and the resilience to keep going? But there is a way of shifting, and it's not absolute. It's not always going to be the case. But at least to some degree, there's a way of shifting your experience of the world so that even when things are really hard, you still see the value in like, this is an opportunity for me to learn something else about myself, sitting here in pain, in discomfort. Like, that's interesting. And, what can I get out of this? And in like a very practical sense, some of the lessons I've learned are like, oh, this pain in my hip, it comes from tightness in my hip. And if I learn to relax it, sitting here, using my breath and my posture, then it feels a lot better. And sometimes I would never have gotten to that place to be able to relax it, to have the sense of urgency, or in this case, maybe desperation, to like actually just fully relax, unless I had gotten that uncomfortable. And so when that experience has become basically like a new habit, where it's not a knee jerk, like, oh, this is uncomfortable, I don't want to be near it. But like, okay, this conflict, this feeling, like there could be something here. Let me go back to my tools of my breath, my posture, my concentration. And then, yeah, that does contribute to, again, that sense of like, how can I move through life in a different way? Can I change the tone or my experience or someone else's experience through these fundamental things?
The question, what does this have to teach me? And to be able to keep asking that. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm conscious of time and this question of what does this have to teach me? I'm also curious about the questions that may be coming from our audience, and just wondering, Peace, if anything has come in through the Q&A that we might be able to address in the next 20 or so minutes.
Yes, thank you for this conversation. I'll read one here. It says, deep bows to you both for this life-giving and much needed conversation. This conversation deeply resonates with me as a South Asian practitioner. Presently, as an Asian American Sangha, we are processing the recurring harm of cultural appropriation from white dominant convert Buddhist institutions. We are exploring how to skillfully respond as a collective rather than as individuals who've all felt exhausted by the lack of or limited responses. I'm wondering if both of you might speak to how we might engage with such convert institutions as Asians and Asian Americans. What could Black solidarity look like in such cases?
I think I have a little bit of a question, and I don't know if Sarwang can, the person who asked the question, can elaborate. I mean, do you have to interact with them? Like the question is, how do we interact with these white dominant convert sanghas that feel like they're playing a role in the appropriation of your culture and your practices? And I guess my question is sort of, and again, I'm like the luxury of being at the back of a valley in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I even deleted social media from my phone recently because I was just like, yeah, and I'm so much happier. And our geographic isolation has made it a lot easier for us to just go deep into what we do, and to just, I'm so glad that we just very rarely, if ever, feel like we need to compare ourselves or change what we do because of what folks, in these white convert communities that are getting a lot more airtime and attention are doing. Like, we never really went virtual. We don't do training over Zoom. We don't do koan practice over Zoom, like any of those things. And we're just very happy continuing to do very deeply what it is that we do. And so for us, I think it's also just like trying to be strategic about where we put our energy. If it's exhausting for you to engage with those folks, then it might be that your limited energy is better put somewhere else, just investing in the things that are going to make your community feel really vibrant and good. And then the other side of the coin might be to revisit some of the traditions and practices that you have as a community that are about building strength and resilience. One of the things that I've noticed in Western and American Buddhism is there is this, sometimes in my view, pretty erroneous idea, like especially in the Zen world, that like Zen is very quiet and has to be very meek and submissive and passive. And just that is never my experience with Japanese Zen practitioners. And it's not my experience at Chozenji. And so, I think a lot of us feel this pressure to adopt the softness and the gestures and the lexicon of this sort of this whitewashed Asian spirituality that's prevalent and that we see get a lot more airtime in the West. And I think a lot of our traditions do have a certain fierceness in their history. And I would encourage you to look back and see if it's there, and see if it's there to reclaim and dig into, as particularly as Asians. I know we feel really reticent to be fierce, but I've personally gotten a lot out of doing a lot of martial arts and a lot of yelling.
Well, what an important and provocative response, Cristina, because I appreciate that guidance, or that orientation towards turning towards the community. And what it reminds me of is actually quite a lot of Black feminism, particularly the name that comes to mind is Audre Lorde. And, she was fairly balanced. And I'll just say this, of course, from an outside perspective. I never knew her personally. I am steeped in her writings, but she was just very direct in saying, like, I have limited energy and I'm going to spend it on work that matters most to me. And basically, like, white women, do your work and I'm going to do mine. And I'm going to do it amongst women of color. And she was just really clear, like, I'll give you some, but you can't have all of me. And I'm gonna resource myself, and I'm also going to resource the women who need it most. And she was unapologetic about that. So that's what your response brings up to me. And I think there is some need to engage the dominant structures, but my advice, which really I think reverberates on your own response, Cristina, is to not give all of yourself away, and and to have really high boundaries around what is asked. Because I often think, as individuals, and I'm thinking of particular teachers that I have who have become quite exhausted as individuals and trying to confront white, predominantly white Buddhist institutions, there's this sense that a lot is asked of us, right? There can be a kind of exploitative nature. We have to be really protective of ourselves and our communities and turn towards the people and the work, the relationships that matter most. And when we're called upon, if we have capacity, we can respond. But yes, to resource ourselves so that we're not giving all of ourselves away.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And then I think the only thing I would add is that if, say, Black solidarity is important to your Sangha, then you have to have the resources to actually be able to show up. And sometimes maybe in uncomfortable situations because of, again, suffering with. And yeah, you just really need your own resources and strength to be able to do that. And it's not, and you have to make the hard choices sometimes, like Rima was saying, about just where are you going to resource yourself and then spend your energy so that it can be applied in the right places.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I think the next question will add on to what you've been saying. It says, thank you so much for your insight. I deeply appreciate your discussion of the origins of affinity in Black and Asian communities. What reflections can you offer on the role of Buddhist Sanghas and racial healing and reconciliation to address the history of mutual harm and trauma between our communities as a result of anti-Blackness, xenophobia, and historically being pitted against one another in the United States?
Well, this was much of the origin of initiating this particular conversation, was to ask that question, to be really intentional. And I do feel like, Cristina, much of what you said this evening has been, I'll use this word very intentionally, very healing for me, because I think I've had a sense of being somewhat tentative. And I mentioned at the outset, a little bit anxious. I think that analysis of how Dharma is colonized in this country and how we tend to meet each other through white Buddhist interpretations rather than as Black and Asian Buddhists plays a factor. Is a factor. And so it seems to me like being so very intentional about creating relationships and not filtering it through the larger, very well-funded, predominantly white institutions, but rather venturing out so that we are attempting to create community in a kind of conversation and do some of this hard work, really trusting our practices. I think that's what I am mostly taking away from this conversation, is that for me, within Black Buddhist circles, I go in with a sense of trust. Like, here are people who are doing their work, and I have less anxiety about being projected upon or dismissed or in some way offensive by my very embodiment when I'm amongst Black Buddhists. Black people, broadly speaking, we have internalized so much harm, and we tend to project that onto each other. And yet within Black Buddhist circles, I tend to have more trust. And what I'm taking away from this conversation is that I can do that in Asian and Asian American Buddhist Sanghas as well. I can go in with a sense of trust rather than a fear that somehow my embodiment will be rejected. So that's an opening for me. And I am curious to hear your response as well, Cristina.
I think I'm hesitating just because I don't want this to come off as sounding like I'm saying that Buddhist institutions should not address race and racism. But I feel like before, as Buddhist institutions or as Buddhists, we can really answer or approach that question, we just have to make sure that as people, we've done that work. So like as a community member, as a neighbor, as a family member, as a coworker, as a member of our voting populace, like, are you doing that work of understanding the dynamics and the history of race in this country and uprooting the internalized racism that you have within you? And then it just feels more logical to me that you would be able to step into a community, even a religiously based community, and have a sense of like, oh yeah, this is off. We need to address this. But there's something about like, you know, how do we address this as Buddhists that just doesn't quite sit 100% well with me. And I think it's because, it might be because I've been in situations where we're losing the radical aspects and the transcendent aspects of Buddhism. And we're doing disservice to sort of Kevin Kwashi's point, losing the inner life and the essence by really focusing on the social and the political. That's coming off wrong. Sometimes I think that the best work that anyone can do on any political issue, including ones around race, is just to make sure that they're the best person that they can be. And you have to interrogate that through internalized and systemic racism too. But it fundamentally just comes down to, are you doing the work on yourself? Are you doing that work as an institution? I would say that a lot of it feels like it comes back to looking at our approach to Buddhism in the first place. And again, to my point of, if our starting point is to recognize that mainstream Buddhism is Asian Buddhism, and that we've been sold this bill of goods that the dominant American Buddhist experience is a white convert experience, I think then we fundamentally start to engage it a little bit differently. I think if people start there, frankly, and can work with that, and figure out how to approach that, they're in a much better place to approach how, as a Buddhist institution, they respond to anti-Blackness and homophobia and the other ways in which systems of oppression that dominate American society show up in any place we're in relationship. But I feel like because of the specifics of Buddhism being an Asian religion, still actively practiced predominantly by Asians who were being actively erased in this moment, I feel like that is a really important just starting place to understand the Dharma itself, where he's actually wanting a place that in the Buddhist churches of America and in Jodoshin Buddhism, where he gets to hold on to and celebrate his Japanese ancestry, and then also his Japanese American ancestry, with ancestors who lived through World War II and internment and were resilient in the face of those circumstances. And sometimes I do wonder what that relationship is between being able to have a pan-cultural society where we're all sort of mutually intimate with each other's cultures and mutually supportive, and what the relationship is between that and actually having our own home bases where we feel like we get to do that. And so sometimes I think that the answer is to not feel like every place has to have representation from every group, but that there's a relationship, for example, that there's a relationship to where are the South Asian Buddhist communities that exist into themselves, and is there a way for you to support them? It's the this melting pot instinct that we have, that we all have to be doing the same thing together. I'm not sure that that's true. I think that we can find more places where we can be together, supporting one another, doing the same thing, if we also feel like we have that strong home base and a place where we feel safe and where we get to lean fully into sort of where we come from and who we are, a full expression. So like, I wouldn't want to be a Korean American person who goes into, for example, like well, I think I want to be more careful about how I say that. I know that that's a little bit of a provocative question because it feels like I'm saying, I'm talking about separating people, but I've personally found a lot more ability to engage when I have a strong home base, somewhere where I have that feeling like Rima was talking about, that you get to go and feel safe. And then it's possible to go into other environments where then we can share our culture. But there's a depth that otherwise I was missing when I wasn't able to just really sort of do my thing in a way. I'm very nervous about having said that.
Cristina, can I ask a follow-up question related? And I apologize if this is misconstrued in any way, but I was wondering if the question is getting at shadism amongst Asians, broadly speaking, so South Asians who may be closer to my complexion, and then thinking of East Asians in terms of geography who are lighter skinned, and how amongst, again, you know, these are labels that have been applied from the top down, but how colorism may function within an Asian Buddhist community. And what I was wondering, although again, I don't want to misconstrue this question, but maybe the question is suggesting, is there any kind of recognition or challenge that you are aware of, or is there a way to acknowledge that within an Asian or Asian American Buddhist Sangha? I apologize if that is,
yes,
but that was my follow-up question.
That's an easier way of looking at it, I think, which is, I mean, the color, the dark-skinned and light-skinned hierarchy, I mean, it's a construct of white supremacy. And that's very easy to just be like, yeah, I mean, we don't have to subscribe to that as Asian Americans, as any people. We can reject it in the same way we would in any other context. And it behooves Asian Americans of East Asian and Southeast Asian descent to recognize that that is part of white supremacy, this privilege that we give to the lighter skinned. And that, I mean, we simply don't have to accept it. And we don't have to reify it. I would put it that way. I think where my mind was going was towards cultural distinctions, having different culture, language, food, mores, traditions, and sort of that sense of like, I want a place where I get to live deeply into specific traditions, because that gives me strength. And then that actually feeds my ability to have really intimate and deep relationships with people from different cultures and traditions. But when we're talking about just colorism, I mean, that we just have to reject as part of white supremacy.
Thank you for that. That will have to have been our last question. So really just inviting both of you for any closing words or comments before we close for the evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peace, and Cristina, and our interpreters. Thank you so much. And Cristina, I just want to really acknowledge your practice and how that came through tonight, and how much I received even over Zoom, your ability to communicate the depth of your practice. And it's not a small thing to say that I feel this deeper both desire, but I think openness with regards to trust. It's not a small thing for someone like me who has really been think out of survival, needed to or sought to have a lot of protection, to just say, okay, I can relax a bit. And also there's a kind of openness, and it's not at all to dismiss the nuances of everything we've just talked about, including anti-Blackness and shadeism and colorism and what have you, as much as to say, I can also really lean into the importance of practice and trust that is the center of what this identity and this doctrine and these various rituals give us, which is this cultivation of inner life. So how that helps us meet each other and how that helps us mirror each other, all of that is quite beautiful for me. And I'm grateful to you for being able to bring that in front of me personally and also our community that has gathered here tonight.
Well, I'm so grateful to you, Rima, in no small part for having the courage to spark this conversation, which we were both apprehensive about getting into. And in part because I think both of us feel like this really deserves an entire conference of its own, not just an hour and a half. And I found myself like stepping into moments where I was like, I wish that this was a conversation that a room of us could have, that everyone in the Zoom, we could be sitting in the same room to have this conversation face to face. It's very difficult speaking into the ether and not knowing how my words will land, and people not having a chance to pull me aside and say, I really liked that, or I thought that was really problematic and I didn't appreciate it. And so there's just a lot of courage on your part in seeding this discussion, and by doing it on Zoom to reach the most people that we could. And I hope that what it does translate into in the future is an opportunity to have more of these discussions at greater length and with more intimacy and face-to-face, because it certainly deserves it. And I think we need that. We need that to be together physically in our bodies, not just through our words and our image.
Yes, I welcome that. I invite that. Let's make it happen. We'll make it happen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peace. Thank you, interpreters. Be well, everyone.